We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. All right, so welcome everyone to my thesis reading. Bear with me, I'm a little bit nervous, so it might get kind of weird, because I do that sometimes. To start off, my thesis title is Saugeen First Nations number 29, a case study of Aboriginal youth identity, as I'm exploring youth identity through the lens of that particular reserve. So I remember standing about a year ago in Sheila's office, and I was talking to her about my thesis and all the challenges presented to me by my learning disabilities, because they make writing very difficult and frustrating for me. It takes a long time and I don't like it usually. And she looked at me with this look of confusion and said, "Why would you do this to yourself?" I asked myself that a lot of times in the last year and a half while I've been working on this, and I didn't really know the answer to it until yesterday when I went to the printers and got to hold these things in my hand, and I felt a lot of pride and accomplishment at having actually finished this. So there are a few people that I need to thank for the fact that it actually happened. To begin with, I would really like to thank the youth that I interviewed. Words cannot express how grateful I am for having spoken with, and I was amazed by their openness and willingness to speak to a relative stranger for the most part. Their words were intentional and insightful, and without them, my thesis would not have been possible. And the memories of my interactions with them has provided constant motivation to make this thesis to be the best that it can be. So thank you for your honesty, your trust, and your time. It's great. It's extremely difficult to put into words the gratitude that I feel in general about this, and it's entirely impossible for me to name each and every person that has helped me. Were it not for the community surrounding SSU, I would not have considered this a possibility. I owe a special thank you to each of the professors that have helped me develop the skills necessary to do this writing, alumni who have come before me and showed me the immense joy and stress of embarking on such a pilgrimage. I also owe a huge thank you to all of my friends and family who have supported me through this process and put up with all of my craziness. In particular, I want to thank Shady. I will never be able to repay you for all that you've done for me. The innumerable hours you spent editing my thesis and your constant emotional support through this process have been crucial for my success, and I will forever be grateful for these gifts. To Walter, thank you for always ensuring that I was aware of any events, news, items, and books that were relevant to my topics, because without your constant encouragement that my stress was a normal part of this process and your ongoing patience, I probably also would not have gotten this done. And to Lois, thank you for helping me to believe in my topic despite my criticisms. Thank you for the countless hours you spent with me, helping me work through my ideas and editing my writing. Your persistent reminders that I was capable of completing this process despite my own doubts have been invaluable. So, I'm going to give a really brief overview here. This thesis explores Aboriginal youth identity through a case study of the Saugeen First Nation, which is a reserve in Bruce County, Ontario. Through interviews with youth from this reserve, 3 main themes surrounding identity were revealed, which is family, history, and education. Theories surrounding developmental, cultural, and social identity are researched and applied to the themes from the interviews. Through sharing the narratives of the youth of one community, it is hoped that this thesis might generate a regarding the important role of First Nations people within Canada, historically, but also in the present and into the future. Such an awareness will not only recognize their valiant perseverance in spite of numerous historical and ongoing disadvantages, but will create space for healthier intercultural engagement between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples who inhabit this land. Now, you might want to know why this is actually important to me to begin with. So this topic surrounding Aboriginal peoples in Canada has been really important to me since a very young age. I grew up in a town called Southampton, Ontario, and this town is neighbors with the Saugeen community. More particularly, my backyard backs onto the boundary line between this community. So it has been a place that I've known about essentially since I was born. But I didn't really know too much about it until I went to a different school. So in grade 2, I switched schools to GC Houston Public School, which is the school in Southampton. And this is where most of the youth from the First Nations community go. As we got older through that process, I began to notice that the youth from the Saugeen community treated those of us in town differently, and those of us who lived in town tended to treat them differently. I was a little too young at the time to really understand what this was all about, but I knew that it made me uncomfortable. as I grew up, I continued to go to school with these people all through high school until I left. I became more familiar with the reserve as I got older too. I'd spend more time going there. They have a place called the amphitheater where with nature most of the time because it's just a lot of wilderness by the river and it's great. And so I would go there a lot to do that. And then in my last year of high school, I did a co-op at GC Houston with kids in grade 5 and 6. And it was here that I was able to witness the social divide that I had experienced so much while I was attending that school, which was a very formative experience for me, being able to see it a little from a different perspective. And then the next year I came to SSU, and when I went home that summer, I was asked to help out with a youth group for my church. And this year, the year that I did that, we'd invited a youth group from the reserve to come for kids in grades 6 to 12. And when they first came, it was very interesting because there was a very noticeable emotional wall up around them. And it was such an amazing experience to be able to see those walls come down as them through playing games and just talking to them, and the impact that we had by just showing a general interest in their lives was really and so it is here that my narrative has kind of informed this thesis topic, because watching these youth come alive as they were able to share their experiences with me and other leaders initiated my desire to learn more about their story and share it with other people. When I first confided in someone close to me that I was considering writing my thesis on First Nations youth, I was met by a considerable amount of skepticism and the words, "I just don't think there are any answers." And it hurt a lot at the time, and I was really frustrated and upset. But then I realized that that is exactly the reason why I wrote this thesis. I needed to be able to challenge these perspectives and stereotypes and assumptions that we all generally hold, whether we want to admit it or not. And so that's why this has been such a wonderful experience for me. As an undergraduate pursuing a degree in international studies with a minor in psychology, I've drawn on both these fields throughout my thesis. And it's not primarily a study in psychology, but that was drawn on heavily as I tried to study identity, which is very psychological. The youth are the future of the community, and in a broader context, it seems appropriate to hear their story. To simply spend time in groups with people who are the same as us is not great for fostering understanding and appreciation and expanding our worldviews. So therefore it makes sense to spend time with people who are different than us so that we can gain mutual appreciation and trust. So I want to go over the history of this community very, very, very briefly because it's very long and confusing, and there's a lot of treaties that it doesn't make sense to go into, but you can read my thesis if you're interested, which will be great. So the history is kind of important because it is a theme that came up in the interviews, and it helps to give a bit of context behind the actual community as well as for the youth that live there. So disputes over land are a common feature of the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and governments in Canada. And this has been occurring since at least the 17th century, a little bit before that also. Prior to European settlement, the Aboriginal peoples lived in harmony with the land, which is a really important aspect. They hunted and gathered food and medicine, they made traditional clothing out of tanned animal skin, and they had common spiritual beliefs that their creator gifted them with their values and traditions. And then in the 1500s, the Europeans started to truly settle in North America because they were attracted by the vast resources, and then they began to trade European goods for the furs that the Aboriginal people had for them. In 1701, there was a grand settlement that happened with the Governor General of New France, and the delegates from 30 First Nations tribes who were allied with France. And this was a peace treaty that ended about a century of war that had been going on amongst these groups. And it ended many arguments surrounding hunting and fishing lands, and it also increased trade. And then in the 18th century, there was significant British settlement. And then late in the 18th century, King George III issued a royal proclamation saying that the Indian Territory was reserved for Aboriginal use unless they chose to surrender the land. And this encouraged negotiations and First Nations people who wished to give up their land. You might wonder why they'd want to give up their land, but it's because they got lots of financial gain from doing that, which was an interesting dynamic because it took the land from something that they could live with and inhabit in harmony with it to something that they owned, which had not previously been something that they'd considered it as before. Which is great. So they leased land for rent, they sold the land, and then they were all moved to an island that some guy thought would let them live separate from the European settlers because that's what they wanted. But really this is probably just justification for claiming more mainland for non-Aboriginal people at the time. And because European settlers continued to intrude on Aboriginal land, Queen Victoria issued another royal declaration in 1847 to give them back the rights to some of their land. Over the following 50 years after that, the Saugeen Ojibwe people ceded even more of their lands, leaving them only the Cape Croker Reserve, which is now known as the Chippewas of Nawash unceded, and the Saugeen Reserve. And then through the last half of the 19th century, the Saugeen band was pressured to surrender more of their land, especially right near Southampton, because Southampton had the only harbor within many kilometers north of a town called Goderich, which is why it was one of the first villages to be settled within the Saugeen territory. However, the Saugeens resisted their pressure to move from their land because they had a strong historical and cultural connection to the land. So then they didn't let anyone move on, which is great. And so they put a bunch of initiatives in place at that point to help make their community stronger. So they prevented chronic alcoholics from getting yearly payments and interest money and things like that to show a commitment to keeping the territory so that they believed their community was just as good as what the European settlers believed their communities were, which is great. In 1968, roughly 90% of their Lake Huron fishing islands were returned to them, which was great. And these reserves are still in a constant state of change, but there hasn't been a significant shift in land ownership in many years. However, the numerous changes, disputes, and agreements have left their mark on the identity of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. They were forced to view the land they were part of through a lens of ownership, stripping them of some of their connection with the ecology of the land. In 1971, this man named Reverend Earl Stotesbury was assigned to the Wesley United Church, which is on the land that the amphitheater is on, and he's the one who made the amphitheater come into existence. So he developed 20 acres of 100 acres of land that was surrounding the church, and then built the amphitheater, which is a place that can connect people to the land, the history, and the culture of the First Nations people there as soon as you enter it, pretty much, which is really great. Which is great. So another important aspect of the Aboriginal history, too, is the prevalence of Indian residential schools in Canada. These schools were created in conjunction with the Government of Canada and various church denominations as a way to educate First Nations youth and also to spread Christianity. Many of these students were sent to schools outside of their communities, as was the case for the Saugeen Ojibwe people. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later in my presentation. In her book, Teenage Citizens, which Ellen Sears recommended to me, Constance Flanagan states, "People need narratives, stories that they can tell that provide direction and purpose that help them make sense of their lives. And thus, the history of the Saugeen First Nations is integral to the identity of the community's youth. It has helped to shape their perceptions of themselves, their communities, and their role in society in both positive and negative ways, through the stories that are shared with them by their families and their community. The necessity of the historical narratives of the youth of Saugeen becomes apparent through the interviews conducted for this study." I'm going to talk just very briefly about the methodology I had when I conducted these interviews. I really wanted to do interviews for my thesis because I feel like all too often we make assumptions about First Nations peoples rather than actually listening to their stories. So I wanted to be able to meet with them to figure out what they felt was important rather than putting my own stereotypes, my own perceptions on it on that level. So I managed to interview 8 youth from the Saugeen community, and of these 8, only one of them wanted their name withheld from my thesis, which was really great because then I was able to honestly share their stories. And it was kind of interesting because those who were the most forthcoming with their information were the most adamant that their names be included in my thesis, which was quite neat. And so the purpose was to gather qualitative data, so I was not looking for statistics. I just wanted to get a better understanding of what they cared about. So I met with them in various places like Tim Hortons or various cafes, took some of them out for dinner just to spend time with them and have a conversation. I asked them each 7 semi-structured questions, which was really just to foster some communication and dialogue with them, more so than to get any specific answers out of them. That's great. So the 3 themes, as I mentioned, that came up were family, history, and education. And although the interview process wasn't always comfortable for me or for the youth, and nor was the writing process very comfortable. I believe that their stories are an integral strand of the web that connects Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. So it was very important to do that. So moving on to what identity is. This is a really complex concept that a lot of people have tried to define over a long period of time, and there is still a lot of discussion about what it really is. But when asked what they thought identity was, the youth all came up with a simple definition that started out as, it's who you are, which is probably what I would say in such a situation. And in a very basic sense, this is true, but further research reveals a deeper meaning. Not only is identity the way in which one sees oneself, it also encompasses a level of attachment to things such as specific groups, geographical locations, or beliefs. Adolescence is kind of a very complicated time for people too, so looking at youth can be challenging. The World Health Organization says that adolescence is the critical stage between childhood and adulthood, involving significant biological growth and development. Through this stage, they're going through a lot of sexual and physical maturation, they're gaining social and economic independence, they're gaining abstract reasoning and forming mature relationships. And so though there's a lot of potential for growth during this period, individuals are developing their sense of identity, which makes it a time of considerable risk in which their social contexts are putting a lot of pressure on them, and they can be very easily influenced by them. It is this complexity and susceptibility to influence that gives value to the study of identity of First Nations youth. This particular group of adolescents faces all of the normal challenges of teenage life and modern society, but they also encounter other potentially significant difficulties based on ethnic and geographical factors. These obstacles undoubtedly affect the ways in which Aboriginal youth perceive both their personal and collective cultural identities, which becomes apparent in the results of the interviews conducted with the youth of Saugeen First Nation and throughout the literature surrounding identity. About, sometime in February last year, I believe, I was at the Vineyard at church, and I was talking with Keith Turner about my thesis, and he said, in some towns, all you have to do is say your name and your story is told. Visible minorities don't even need to say their name. People look at them and their story is already told. I think this is a really valuable statement because I think that's true, and so that's why looking at identity, I really want to focus also on these interviews. So to go through some theories, I have 3 that I looked at in my thesis. I looked at Erikson's developmental theory, I looked at John Barry's Aboriginal cultural identity, and I looked at Alexa Ispas's, her name is difficult to say, social identity theory also, which is great. So to begin with Erikson, he is considered one of the most influential psychoanalysts of the 20th century, and there's a lot of dispute around his work, but his developmental model provides a bit of a framework for understanding the role confusion that emerges throughout the individual's search for identity. And what I thought was really important about his identity in particular is that he focuses on social interactions as a basis for identity, which I think is a lot of, it resonates with me, a lot of how people begin to know themselves. So the period between the age of 12 and 18, he calls identity versus identity diffusion. There's a few different names for that period also. In the book I was reading, this is what it was called. And youth in this stage focus on how they're perceived by others rather than how they perceive themselves. And they have a bit of an internal struggle as they attempt to merge their childhood identity with the identity that they see in their role models that they want to exemplify. And youth identity is derived from the conviction that one is learning effective steps towards a tangible future and the development of a defined personality within one's own social reality. Aboriginal youth may experience some degree of role confusion in the midst of their identity crisis. Such confusion may result if youth feel unable to live up to their social standards, whether self-determined or upheld by a larger group. This may be exacerbated by a number of factors, including but not limited to ethnic, social, economic, and cultural differences between themselves and their non-Aboriginal peers. One of the youth, whose name is Kyle, he kind of expressed this when he said, I guess in our society today, our own identities, right? It's more what was given to us. Because when you're a native person, you're just a native person. Like around here, when you're from the res, you ride the res bus. Your name's not your name, you're an Indian. So Erikson states that identity fusion is when people act out based on the doubt of one's ethnicity or feeling pressured by their assumed roles within their social reality. And so, for example, Erikson said that youth can become remarkably clannish, intolerant, and cruel in their exclusion of others who are different in skin color or cultural background. This, however, can be mitigated by the perception that they're learning valuable skills for the future as it gives them some direction in their lives. Moving on to Barry's cultural identity, he states that this is probably the most helpful when considering Aboriginal identity because, as he says, Aboriginal peoples in Canada share many cultural attributes and frequently a common history in relation to the larger society. So even though there are cultures within the Aboriginal term, this just tends to give them a more broad overview of that. So this theory is kind of focused on the fact that Aboriginal identity is a combination of features working together to express how Aboriginal individuals see themselves in the context of other Aboriginal individuals. So there are four main factors in this. One's perception or belief that one is Aboriginal, the sense of importance or attachment one has to Aboriginal groups, so whether this is an important aspect of one's social identity or not. Positive or negative feelings about being Aboriginal, and the degree of identity maintenance desired by an individual. So in this case, do they want to keep and display their Aboriginal identity, or do they want to change or hide it? He also says there are two main identity points within that, symbolic and behavioral. So symbolic identity is a positive esteem regarding their identity and their desire to maintain it. So that's kind of their beliefs and values, but these are not necessarily going to be outwardly expressed because they may be wishing to abide laws and rules, or they may be afraid of ridicule and discrimination, or they may feel a sense of shame about their beliefs and values. And then there's the behavioral identity, which is the outward expression of these values, which, for example, can be their language, religion, or expression through clothing. Moving on to social identity theory, this is the belief that identity comes from the perception of membership within a particular group, so focusing on intergroup relations. People tend to act differently when they associate themselves as part of a group rather than as an individual. And while it is possible to belong to many groups at once, it's the membership perceived at a specific moment that determines their social identity. These theories correlate with Erikson's understanding that identity is created through one's interactions with others, which now brings us back to the interviews. Yay, it's the most exciting part. So I'm going to start with the theme of family through this. And this, in the interviews, this came up when I asked the interviewees to express to me what their happiest and saddest moments were in their lives. And usually in both instances, it ended up being revolving around their families, which was quite interesting. For example, Kyle told me this slightly humorous story of his sister falling off her bike in their driveway, and she fell headfirst into their car, which dented the car, I think, and she was okay, but her parents weren't happy, but he thought it was very funny. He said it was the best day of his life. And then there was another youth named Miranda, and she told me a story of when her nephew was born as being the happiest day of her life, and she was working at the time, and she was able to leave work, and Russ let her leave so she could rush to the hospital and make it in time for him to be born, which was really great. In relation to the saddest moments, it was usually in regards to the loss of family members through death. At one point. Family plays an important role in society. It protects and meets the basic needs of dependent children. It teaches language and behavior through example instruction, and it provides basic values and beliefs. It allows individuals to move into more independent lifestyles, but even as they move into more independent lifestyles, they can still find that family is a very important emotional life or support system. Traditionally, Aboriginal families shared the responsibilities of caring for its members through the extended family, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings, and the greater community that they're in. And this is an ideal that's still held today, though it's not usually as an integral part of their lifestyle. It is still very important to them. This was shown through one of the interviewees, Lakota. She said, "I like when Aboriginal people are in a community. They're really strong, and they're really supportive to one another. And it's not just like any any community. It's an Aboriginal community because it's so close. It's like a big family. So this really shows how the community to them can be family, regardless of whether they're biologically related or not. This was particularly poignant coming from her because the story of her family life is quite sad. About 8 years ago, she was put into foster care based on a false story that one of her family members made up. They called the CIS and told them that her mother had strangled her brother, which was not true. And so they got put into foster care, and she just got back home recently. And so they went through a series of foster homes, and some of them were good, some of them were not good at all. But it just broke up their family somewhat unnecessarily. She said while they were still gone, her mother fought to get them back, and eventually did get them back onto the reserve. They ended up in this program called Kinship Care, in which the youth are put either with extended family members or with other people within the community. And in this, well, it's good because it brought her back into the context of the community, so they were able to work under the court system there. It was still hard for her mother because they were placed with her mother's close friends, but she was still unable to see her children, which put a lot of strain on. The program is great because it shows an effort to reconcile the Aboriginal values with the traumatic experiences that families are going through as this happens. Family has the ability to both positively and negatively affect the identity of Aboriginal youth. For individuals with a healthy family environment and who have a strong connection to the community, they may feel a strong sense of pride in their culture and values as they can openly express them without fear of ridicule. However, individuals who have families that have been broken apart by death or other difficult events may feel disadvantaged to their peers and embarrassed that they do not have the perfect family life. Both Erickson and Ispas say that we need family to learn roles, youth need their family to learn roles in society and to form opinions about others, history, culture, etc., so that they can experience, so the youth can experience role confusion in the future if they don't have their strong family ties, which is interesting. Now, a lot of what family can do also for these youth is they can tell them a lot of the history of their people, so I'm going to move into that category now, which is great. So many of the youth felt as though both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal individuals should learn about the history of their peoples so that there can be a greater understanding amongst Canadians. When asked what 2 things he would like people outside of Saugeen First Nations to know about his community, the first thing Kyle said was, "We went through a lot of the history that you've read about in history books." This comment provides a clear example of how the study of both formally recorded history and oral history is valuable to the understanding of identity, as it offers context to the realities of these individuals and communities. So, as I mentioned, one of the really important aspects of this is their land, which can lead to both positive and negative perceptions of their identity in a number of ways. But kind of in summation, they might feel somewhat negatively towards being Aboriginal as far as land goes, because their ancestors were unable to keep the land that they had, and as well they ended up owning it rather than living with it as they did. However, they still have a strong sense of pride within their relationship with the land, and Lakota kind of expressed this because she was talking about how she's trying really hard to learn from her parents from her grandparents how to live off the land so that she can better encourage an appreciation of the ecology there and whatnot, which we thought was really interesting. As well, they have the amphitheater, which allows the community to share their appreciation for nature because they have set aside a place that is specifically to remain relatively natural. But they have groomed garden and stuff there too, but it's just a nice place for that. But another really important part to the Aboriginal narrative of history is the residential schools, which is generally a very sad story. And Kyle expressed the importance of understanding this when he said, "Everything we have right now, the reason we're skipping class, the foundation of that is all history. Like the residential schools. That's why we have so little culture within us. The people who can use the language in our community are 60 or 70, and the youth can say hello. I'm not even fluent, and that's because we were so negatively influenced." So this quote clearly shows the impact that the residential schools have had on at least some of the youth there. So as I mentioned, the schools were run by the Government of Canada and the churches to educate the First Nations youth. And more than 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children attended these schools between 1857 and 1996. For the residential school settlement agreement has listed 131 residential schools in Canada, and 14 of these were located in Ontario. None of these 14 were actually on the Saugeen Reserve, but this has also had an impact on the Saugeen people because the students who went to that school were taken away from their community and their families to attend these. It's often well known that the life in these schools was quite difficult for the students who went there. They were stripped of their right to speak their languages and were punished if they were caught using it. They often did not have their basic needs met, and they were removed from their families and communities, as I mentioned. The last school was closed in 1996, but it wasn't until 2008 that the Honourable Stephen Harper apologized to the Aboriginal peoples who had been sent to these schools. It's also interesting to note that many of the churches apologized for their involvement in that as well. So, in his book, Identity and the Life Cycle, Erickson says, therapeutic efforts as well as attempts at social reform verify the sad truth that in any system based on suppression, exclusion, and exploitation, the suppressed, excluded, and exploited unconsciously believe in the evil image which they are made to represent by those who are dominant. In this way, the residential schools condition many of the students to believe they were inherently inferior. Therefore, some of the survivors to Aboriginal communities after their time in the residential schools brought with them their sense of inferiority, and subsequently this has been passed down to future generations. As such, current Aboriginal youth may feel that they are less than their non-Aboriginal peers based on their cultural and racial differences, signifying negative esteem towards their cultural identity. Furthermore, the social identity theory would argue that this association with a perceived inferior group would cause these individuals to act in such a way that expresses and perpetuates that sense of subordination. The negative experiences in the residential school tended to lead to a negative opinion of education, of the education system within the cultural identity of the survivors. And the last residential school closed only 9 years ago. So while the education system has changed a lot, and it is a lot more positive for the youth who go there now, the survivors' negative regard and lack of understanding of the importance of education has filtered down, which poses a lot of challenges for the First Nations youth today, because the families who are directly influenced by these schools are not likely to have a strong desire to encourage their youth to go to school. And another important aspect of that as well, of the residential schools, is that the students were forced to hide their language in order to follow the rules set before them. And so the pride of their language was somewhat stripped from them, and this contributes to negative esteem regarding their cultural identity as well. And Lakota, in her interview, she said, "Every Aboriginal person I know went through that. They're ashamed of who they are, ashamed to speak their language. And it's amazing when it happens. They feel okay with themselves, and they feel like, wow, I just wish I would have paid attention in Ojibwe class so that I can know how to speak Ojibwe. But no, it doesn't work that way. Because I don't know how to make people feel comfortable about it, really. How do you make anybody feel comfortable with who they are after it's just been changed so much?" So while this quote expresses the kind of negative aspects of the residential schools and how they've affected the language, it also shows a hope for the positive identity surrounding the language, because it shows that people do want to learn the language, at least at some point in their life. So, moving on to education, we'll get back to the concept of language in school later. The United Nations Human Development Index says that roughly 70% of First Nations students living on the reserve between the ages of 15 and 24 will not complete high school due to a lack of access to education. And this has led to an unemployment rate that is twice that of the non-Aboriginal population in Canada, which is kind of an alarming statistic. Without high school education, it can be really difficult to find work because employers are looking for increasingly educated people, which can cause a lot of complications too for those who can't afford further education based on their socioeconomic status. This lack of education could create a negative perception of their cultural identity, particularly if these individuals believe that they were unable to access education because of their Aboriginal status, so whether that means due to the geography of where they are, since some reserves are in very remote locations, or due to their finances. Constance Flanagan says, As research on adolescence theories of education has shown, when teens believe that the purpose of education is to increase status and wealth, they are most alienated academically and less committed to learning. In contrast, when students believe the purposes of education include social responsibility and an understanding of the world, they are more committed to the intrinsic value of learning and more likely to believe that academic success results from personal interest, effort, and from collaborative learning. Unfortunately, education is often presented in a way to gain financial security in the future rather than as a collaborative learning experience for them to be prepared for the future. Although each of the interview participants stated that education was important to them, some of them suggested that they were more dedicated to academic achievement in school than many of their Aboriginal peers, adding an interesting dynamic to their perception of identity. In social identity theory, from the perspective of the social identity theory, the academically successful students can feel alienated from the rest of their peers because they don't fit the prototype or the stereotype of the rest of their peers who don't really have as much interest in succeeding in school. And so one of the interviewees, Emily, she said, "A lot of people have so many talents. They're smart people. They just choose not to pursue their education as others would. Everyone from the reserve is made out to seem really uneducated. When I do well at school, other non-Aboriginal kids say, 'You're in university classes?' Me and my friend, because we are close, we group together. We were in the same education range. We are both in university classes, and we are the only two out of all the kids in our grade. Non-Aboriginal kids think that it's weird that we are at the same level that they are at." So this shows that they are regarded differently by both their Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peers, and thus they may not feel that they fit in with either, which is quite unfortunate because then they don't really have a group from which to gain their identity at that point. However, on a positive note, the Saugeen Reserve is relatively close to the towns, and there is public transportation provided by the school board, so they do have easy access to the school, which is great that geography does not have to be a factor for them. And these supportive measures help to ensure that their Aboriginal heritage has not limited them in their academic pursuits. They also may feel that their access to school allows them to contribute to society both presently and in the future. Attending school provides Aboriginal youth with opportunities to adopt membership in varying groups and thus broadening both their social and personal identities. Through the interview, several of the participants acknowledged the personal importance of their heritage. Moreover, many felt that it would be a tragedy for their people to forget the Ojibwe language. Emily, again, says, "Not a lot of people know the language themselves, even older people, so it's hard to pick it up because the people who teach it don't even really speak it." The Ojibwe teacher at the school was fluent at one point in her life, but she's kind of lost it. She still knows a lot, but it's not the same. As well, another of the youth that I interviewed, her name's Manukami, and she really wants to learn Ojibwe so that she can live on the reserve and teach it to youth in the future. And beyond that, she really wants to inspire within them the desire to learn the language through a variety of interesting activities and different teaching methods, which I thought was a very neat example of how the reversal of the negative stereotype around the native languages. As Aboriginal peoples begin to reclaim their languages and youth begin to take an interest in it, the negative esteem can potentially be reversed. The youth are beginning to feel that they can take pride in their language, transforming it from being solely an aspect of their symbolic identity to an aspect of their behavioral identity. Another of the youth, Sydney, she told a story of a native literature class that she was in at her high school, which is different than the one that I went to. It was in a different city nearby, but she said that a lot of her peers did not understand why it was important to study anything related to Aboriginal people. And she said that this was really, really frustrating for her. So she suggested that a course that focuses on First Nations culture and history would have a lot of impact on the identity of First Nations youth because it could create an interest amongst Aboriginal youth of their heritage and culture and give them the opportunity to learn it if they don't have access to it at home. Furthermore, it would also allow non-Aboriginal youth to gain an understanding, and beyond that, having the staff and faculty of the high schools having somewhat of an understanding also of the history provides a safer environment for so that they can express their cultural values and beliefs, which is great. Another key aspect of education for the Saugeen youth is community service. In the Ontario secondary education system, it is mandatory for students to complete 40 hours of community service in order to graduate. and this can be highly beneficial for the formation of identity within adolescence by encouraging interactions with people who are different than themselves. So now I'm going to move on to my final chapter of this thesis, about youth engagement. So in the book Teenage Citizens that Alan directed me to when I was first talking about my thesis, Flanagan talks about how important civic engagement is for the identity development of youth. So civic engagement is really important so that they can form opinions based around discussions and interactions with other people. But this can pose a problem for people of different ethnicities, because civic opportunities available to youth, within those there is a class and racial divide that is based on a cumulative disadvantage that starts in kindergarten and continues on through grade 12. And this reduces the civic engagement later in life and is further hindered by events such as dropping out of school, which goes back to the aspects of feeling like school is important. Flanagan says, for teens from ethnic minority backgrounds, awareness of their ethnic identity is positively associated with their civic commitments to contribute to local and national communities and to provide tolerance and understanding between their ethnic groups. So their awareness of available opportunities, as well as their desire to become involved, can be influenced by their experiences and view of education, their socioeconomic status, and their proximity to the volunteer opportunities. In this way, the Saugeen youth may perceive that they have fewer opportunities for civic engagement than their non-Aboriginal peers. However, to find these opportunities is integral for fostering understanding between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. This is especially true because Flanagan states that the youth of ethnic minorities are more likely to stimulate intergroup understanding than the youth of ethnic majority groups too. So community service is beneficial for youth because it can provide the opportunity for them to interact and form relationships with others. It also allows them to expand their views on social justice issues. They can have a broader perception of their civic community and their responsibilities to other communities. It's also more likely to encourage them to continue volunteering and being engaged in the community and stuff as they get older. And it provides insight for possible careers for the future, as well as self-awareness of their own strengths and weaknesses. The intergroup tolerance and understanding gained from the civic engagement of Saugeen youth may give them positive esteem regarding their cultural identity, as they will feel as though they are a valuable part of the community. This is demonstrated by Kyle's statement that giving back to the community from outside of it is almost more important than helping from inside. It allows more space for change and different perspectives. This can be particularly true if they believe that their culture and heritage is appreciated by their non-Aboriginal peers and community members, as their identity will have a value in a broader context. So in this way, the youth may be more inclined to outwardly express their cultural beliefs and values, positively strengthening their behavioral identity and making it more consistent with their symbolic identity. Luckily for Saugeen youth, they have a lot of opportunities available to them within the community and within Southampton and whatnot. So they face many societal difficulties. It is still apparent that they're an integral and valued part of the community. The Saugeen Band has shown an increasing dedication to its youth and has been diligently working to provide them with opportunities that will allow them to engage with different aspects of their community and thus expand their worldview through varying experiences. There are a lot of organizations and events that support the social, academic, and employment needs of the youth, and in this way the Saugeen Band helps them to prepare for the futures. So the one that I really want to focus on is called Right to Play. It's an organization called Right to Play. It's based out of Toronto, and it focuses on the transformative power of play to combat societal inequalities. Now, this is mostly volunteer-run, but there are some staff. In Canada, this is focused around Aboriginal youth, and the program is called Promoting Life Skills in Aboriginal Youth, or PLAY. And it recognizes that Aboriginal youth are the future leaders of the communities, and so they seek to engage them as a means to create a positive and meaningful change. So there's a bunch of programs that run through this, a lot of events that promote good health, academics, leadership, teamwork, and so on. On the Saugeen Reserve, it was formed in 2012 in partnership with Right to Play, Bruce Power, and the Ontario Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. The Saugeen Band's Youth Leadership Program is coordinated by Right to Play community mentor April John, and it offers many opportunities for Saugeen youth to be involved in their community. For the 2014 and 2015 year, there were 4 youth groups, and they were all of varying ages. And through this program, there were many youth-led events that were organized, such as a youth movie night, dinner and bingo, an event which was an event for youth and elders, a fundraiser for a year-end trip, and they organized other events such as Halloween haunted houses and March break events, and they had Saugeen's Got Talent too, which was apparently great, so which is awesome. And these opportunities provided have the ability to give the youth of Saugeen positive esteem regarding their cultural identity. The people involved with this particular project regard the youth as a joyful part of the community, and it's likely that many other members of the community do too, especially those who have come into contact with this program through the events that it coordinates. So I contacted April John, who's the coordinator of this program on the reserve, and so she sent me this lovely little testimony that I really want to read just because I found it very impactful. In my own experience, this has been life-changing and so inspiring, not only to me, but also for my community. The youth are my biggest inspiration. I have learned so much about them, about my community, and about myself. They are so hopeful, and they see things from such a different perspective. It's amazing to see their creative minds come together. My greatest joy of the job is the youth in my community. They are all amazing in their own special way, and I feel I help them express that to our community. We meet once a week for a couple hours, and during this time I give them hope, I give them a voice, I give them support, I give them guidance, but most of all, I help them become future leaders. The goal is to empower youth, but with the tools and knowledge I have been taught, I too have become empowered. I just thought that was impactful. There are a bunch, and then there are a lot of other organizations, and there's like a youth center on the reserve, and there's a Boys and Girls Clubhouse program, and through the Southampton, the Bruce County Museum and Cultural Center, they do Aboriginal programs too, where people come in and tell stories and do interpretive programs about the history and whatnot, which is really great. There is, through the high school, there is the Aboriginal Youth Entrepreneurship Program, which is dedicated to teaching Aboriginal youth about entrepreneurship so that they can confidently engage in business activities post-high school, which is really great. And another of the great things that the youth can get involved with is the powwows. There are two. There's one held in August every year on the Saugeen First Nation. There's also one at the Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nation. The powwow at Saugeen is hosted on the second weekend of August at a local recreation center, and the following week is the Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nation. Both these powwows are open to anyone, regardless of race, as it says on the website, for a small fee of $5, making these beautiful and entertaining cultural celebrations easily accessible. And these are things, as I was younger, I used to go to them a lot. I haven't had time in recent years because I'm always working or traveling. Which is fine. So these celebrations are derived from ancient dances performed by warriors of the grass dance societies during the early 19th century to display their brave deeds to their tribes. As the European settlers took more land, the reserves grew, an increasing number of the tribal customs and religions were outlawed. However, the grass dance was allowed, and that is transformed into the modern powwow. The history that has been passed down to the elders says that it was only the men of the grass dance societies that did the dancing. However, the modern powwows invite and accept women to dance amidst the men in the sacred circle. This is a time for communities to gather and celebrate First Nations culture. Many of the youth attend these powwows each year. They dance, they tell stories, sing songs, there's drumming circles. It's very interesting. They dress up in their regalias, which are very elaborate and amazing. And it's just a really incredible time. And in this way, they're truly able to express their cultural values and beliefs through their song and dance. And having the powwows open to the general public creates an awareness and appreciation for the culture amongst all of those who attend. Manukami says, I feel that people should know about our powwows, and they should come out because you get to experience something different. You get to experience a little bit of history. You also get in tune with your body in a way with the dancing and the movement and the music. People and learn new things. The powwows act as a tangible way for the youth to exhibit the behavioral aspects of the cultural identity and to show their appreciation for their membership within the Aboriginal community. So although there is a potential negative aspect to having all of these programs in place, especially the ones that are instigated by the government and whatnot, while they're not inherently harmful to the youth, and they are often very beneficial in a lot of ways, they may have an unintended consequence. And it is possible that access to all of these programs dependent on them in order to be successful. Flanagan, in her book, explains that the youth often support the government within the role that they are accustomed to it playing in their lives, and in this way they may get the impression at a young age that it is acceptable to be dependent on the government. and other organizations or institutions that are providing the programs to them. However, many of the programs available to the youth focus on the development of useful skills to be successful as independent adults, and in this way, perhaps the possible negative outcomes can be mitigated or avoided altogether. So the final thing I want to talk about is the future of Saugeen. Right now, there is a lot of discussion around a plan for the reserve in which they're going to start developing the Village Saugeen Resort and Casino, which is interesting. The band has outsourced the developing of this plan to a company called Winding Road Development, which is based out of the States. From the PDF plan, it says, in addition to being a great community gathering place, the Village Saugeen will provide permanent employment opportunities. To adequately prepare new training and vocational programs should be coordinated with the local schools and colleges. As the village comes to life, work exchange and training programs should be encouraged, providing the local student and youth population with new career insights, experiences, and employment opportunities. So it will create many job opportunities, assuming that it goes through. And this could help the youth feel a lot more confident in their futures as far as their financial situation goes, and it could foster a lot of social interactions as well, which would be great. It may also encourage more post-secondary education with the prospect of promotions within the company, but it could also prevent youth from attending post-secondary school if they were considering it previously, because they may not feel like they have any need to go anywhere if they already have a job, or if it'll put financial strain on their lives. And if they were to go to post-secondary school, I'm assuming that this would affect the programs that they would go into to some degree. So maybe they would choose to go into hospitality and tourism or human resources or other such programs. And it's irrefutable that the arrival of the Village Saugeen Resort and Casino will create a significant change within the Saugeen First Nation number 29. It will bring forth a new chapter in the community, though it has yet to be seen whether this will be positive or a negative one. The village will notably transfigure the physical, social, and economic landscape of the neighborhood, significantly impacting the identities of youth, both in the present and in the future. But it's still in the planning stages, so there is a lot of uncertainty about whether it'll actually come to be. So, on to my conclusion. George Stroumboulopoulos, wow, I can't say his name, it's confusing. He did an interview with Wab Canoe on a YouTube video, and he said, George Stroumboulopoulos said, for the sake of those who wanted Canadians to know that the story of Aboriginal people today isn't limited to the words and the pictures that we've become accustomed to. Pictures that send a message to Native and non-Native Canadians that the only relationship that these two groups have is based on charity. Native and non-Native Canadians can have relationships based on mutual trust and benefit. And this is a lot of what I was hoping to convey with my thesis. In this exploration of Aboriginal youth identity through the lens of the Saugeen First Nation, it has become clear that family, history, and education are incredibly important to shaping these identities. While it may have been possible to anticipate these themes without speaking to any First Nations youth, the interviews conducted during this study have brought these themes to life. They are not just abstract concepts, but are foundational to the heart and soul of the youth as they tell their own narratives. It is important to recognize that the same words do not necessarily possess the same meaning across time, cultures, and languages. Thus, it is possible to conclude that while family, history, and education are vitally important, they may have different connotations for First Nations youth than do for non-Aboriginal Canadians, and thus why their involvement was integral to this. In her book, Belonging to Paradox of Citizenship, former Governor General Adrienne Clarkson writes, "It is not the laws that create how you feel about where you live and whether you belong. It is other people who make you feel that you belong." This is a poignant statement for Canada If the relationship between First Nations and non-Aboriginal Canadians is going to change for the better, non-Aboriginal Canadians must stop anticipating and presuming that we know their story. We must give them room to speak for themselves of what inspires and troubles them. It is only through such conversations that a positive sense of identity and belonging can be nurtured. This thesis has been an invitation for you to set aside your own prejudices and assumptions to listen to the narrative of one of the small First Nations communities, Saugeen First Nation Community number 29. Thank you.
Well, I didn't feel the need to rush Kailyn along too much.
Sorry.
She was
Sorry for going long.
keeping it was. But I think we do have time for some questions and some interaction. And I will ask, Kailyn had mentioned her learning disability, and it would be really helpful. Sometimes questions are a bit complicated. If you could, as best you can, state your question, and then if you need to give sort of the context for the question, state the question, context, restate the question.
And then hopefully I'll be able to answer it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can't promise anything, but I'll try.
And I see Agnes.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Agnes.
I have a very simple question.
Yes.
How did you come into contact with the 8 people that you interviewed?
Well, I was friends with one of them, so I met, which was nice because I was very nervous about doing the interviews. And when I met with him, I asked him if he knew of any other youth who would be interested in, who he thought would be interested in speaking with me, and then asked for their contact information. I also met with a woman named Christine in the First Nations community, and she attends my church, and I met with her to talk about it kind of before I spoke with any of the youth, because I was a little bit nervous about approaching a topic of a community so close to my home. And she was really encouraging, and then also gave me the contact information for a few youth that she thought would love to talk to me about it, which she was right, so it was great in that sense. It was awesome.
Other questions?
Yes.
You mentioned the Indian residential schools. I'm wondering whether there was much reference directly or indirectly to the TRC process, like even Kyle, for example, saying what was lost from it. I'm wondering whether it was partly the TRC that helped make him so confidently aware of that.
Maybe it didn't come up in any of my interviews. I also didn't ask, because if they didn't bring it up, I wasn't going to try to force topics of conversation on them. It was a very interesting fact, though, that it didn't come up at all, especially because there's meetings about it this summer, I believe, and whatnot. But.
Any idea how Kyle became aware? Like, was it family?
Yeah, it was his family. His father was the former chief of the community, so he had a lot of knowledge about it, and he's just very interested in it and puts a lot of time into reading books and researching and whatnot too. So. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned about like the development project.
Yes.
And when I hear casino, it's a fairly loaded word
Yes.
in terms of addictions, etc.
Yes.
You hinted at some of the negative possible outcomes of a casino. Did you want to expand on that?
I don't want to expand too much, especially because I don't really know what's going to happen, and I really don't want to just portray negative.
No, but you did a good job of.
But yeah, I mean, it does pose a lot of questions, and I mean, and really for anyone, not just for the First Nations community, but for any community. I mean, there is promoting gambling and alcohol and whatnot too, and so in that sense, it does raise a lot of questions about in what ways that will impact the community. I mean, it might be positive, but it can also have a lot of negative repercussions. So.
But the vibe has been that it's more of a welcome thing at this point?
As far as I know, there's even not a whole lot of conversation about it that I know of, which makes me think that they might be still trying to figure out what exactly they want on the reserve. So I'm not really sure. I mean, it just came out a couple of years ago, so it's still trying to figure out where it's going. And it is such a large development for such a small community also that it's, debatable where it's going. But, yeah. Sarah.
I know you're just excited to be done.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
But in doing this research and these interviews, have you sort of, in your mind, bookmarked other topics or themes that emerge that you're thinking, oh, someday I'd like to walk down that
Well, yeah, I mean, I have nothing against continuing to read. I just don't really want to write anymore. But the research part is very much what I enjoy about, and mostly what I enjoy in the thesis process. And I'd really like to look more into youth identity and what that really constitutes. Because I looked at 3 kind of theories about that, but I didn't go very deep into them, and I would really, I think, be very interested to do a lot more of that. So hopefully we'll have time to do that over the next little while while I'm not in school. Yes, Bob.
Thank you, Kay.
Wonderful.
Great job. And What from your experience
Mhm.
growing up with these folks and your research, what do you think might be one of the most positive changes or developments that could happen for the sake of Aboriginal youth in your area?
That's a good question. I think maybe this isn't like a specific development, but I really just think more desire from the community surrounding the reserve to understand the reserve and its culture and its history, because I feel like there is becoming a greater awareness of it and a greater understanding and desire, but I also feel like there's still a lot of hesitancy there, and I just think it would be great to have more programs maybe that support that. There are beginning to be more too. I mean, when I was home last fall, I went to a few presentations about Aboriginal history and whatnot, which was really, really interesting, but I think it would be great if we had more of those
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot too, just so that people who do want to know find that information relatively easily, instead of reading books like I did that are quite old and sometimes hard to navigate through. Yeah, and then they can speak with their friends about it and hopefully foster a greater appreciation and desire to learn.
Well, your work is actually increasing that awareness right here.
That's what I hope.
I can imagine you being a leader in that back home.
Maybe.
Thank you.
You mentioned that as on the whole, non-Aboriginal Canadians we have a lot of assumptions about the story
Yes.
Aboriginal Canadians, and it's varied across the country. So
Yeah.
I assume that you had assumptions also. So I was just wondering, what is one of the really surprising things that you learned that you weren't expecting?
I think probably the most interesting thing, and I didn't bring this up in my thesis because I wasn't really sure how it fit in with the themes, but I asked the youth in the interviews whether they felt they associated more with their native or non-native peers, and commented that they associated more with their non-native peers, which was a very interesting aspect. And a lot of times that was in relation to education, because I felt like they just weren't motivated enough, didn't have enough desire to actually do things with their lives. But I was not really expecting that answer, because so many of them were so proud of their culture and their heritage that it's been very, very fascinating.
I think that was my question as I've been listening too. You just brought it closer. Do you think that the 8 youth that you interviewed were a kind of unusually strong group in terms of their development of identity? They sounded like people that were really good at school, that they were enthusiastic to talk with you. In other words, is it I don't mean is it a fair sample?
It definitely had its limitations. Yes.
Your archaeology had to begin where it was going to begin,
Yes.
It seems as though you were dealing with a group of outstanding people.
Yeah, for the most part, yes. There were a few people interviewed that the interviews range from anywhere from about 5 minutes to 10 minutes,
Okay.
Which is why there's not a lot of mention of them within my thesis, because they often, even with prompts, gave me one-word answers, and they were still very helpful, but it just was a very different thing. And they were usually the ones who said that they think school's important, but it's not the most important aspect of their life, or they were the ones who said that they think the history is important, but they don't feel like it really affects them as much too, which is mentioned a little bit more in the methodology section of my chapter too.
Thank you.
Rachel, you had your hand up a few times. So.
It's really interesting. And one of the things I thought I was fascinated by was your discussion of the shifting relationship with the land historically. So the idea of living with the land and ownership of the land. And I suppose there probably is more in the thesis about it, so I should read.
That's right.
You should. More to think about it. But I was just wondering if that came up in any of the interviews, if there was any sense of that relationship with the land being key in identity for the youth, or
Yeah, I think I did come up mostly in my interview with Lakota. She kind of brought it up the most, but she was the one who just talked about how important the environment is and how much she really wants to learn how to live with it, and how proud she was that her people had natural remedies for a lot of ailments and illnesses and whatnot. And a lot of the rest of them really didn't bring it up a whole lot. They just kind of skimmed over that whole aspect of it. Yeah, which is also interesting. Rosie, do you still have a question?
Yeah. I was just wondering if you could recall your questions that you asked them. What were they, and how did you think of those questions?
Thanks. Well, how did I think of them? Is a great question.
Like, was that you mentioned 2 kind of initial interviews that you did?
Yep. Yeah. Well, I had my questions all set before I did any of my. Before I did any interviews with the youth. When I talked to Christine, before I talked to the youth, I don't remember if I had my questions ready at that point. Would you like me to read all my questions?
Like, did they adapt or not adapt? Did they change as you were?
They didn't change as I went, but I kind of prepared for almost everything when I went through this. I had a lot of prompts. So I'd have my question, and then underneath it, I have prompts like, here, if they don't actually give you a lot, like, here are some other questions you can ask them related to these things. And so in that sense, I didn't feel the need to change them. I don't think I changed them at all from when I started to when I did the last one, which was great. I just kind of made more of an effort. I think the one thing that changed is at the very beginning, my friend Kyle was very, very forthcoming with a lot of information. So at the end, he would just tell me random stories about whatever he was thinking about, which was great. But a lot of the other youth didn't do that, so I didn't think to ask him if he had anything else he'd like to share with me at the end of his interview. But then with the rest of them, I felt like I needed to do that, or else I wouldn't have given them enough of a voice necessarily without that. So, which was also a good realization for me.
Sorry, I did one more.
Yes, I did not all your prompts. Okay, so I asked, what are some of your interests and hobbies? How would you define the term identity, and why do you think it's important? How important is your First Nation heritage to you, and how has this affected who you are today? In what ways are you involved in the Saugeen First Nation community? Do you feel that you have more in common with your non-Aboriginal friends and peers, or with members of the Saugeen First Nation community? Tell me about your happiest moment and your saddest. If there were 2 things that you would like the outside world to know about Saugeen First Nation, what would they be? Yeah. That was my yes, I guess.
The whole idea of a reserve or a reservation is just a huge issue.
Yeah.
Some natives feel like everybody should move off the reserve, that they're part of a very oppressive system, and other people seem to see reserves as a focus of identity. How many of the youth, do you know how many of the youth you interviewed actually lived on the reserve, or were planning to go back, or to leave?
Yep. At the time, all but one of them lived on the reserve, and now she is back on the reserve. But even while she was still gone, she was the one who was planning to become an Ojibwe teacher and move back to the reserve anyways. So that just happened sooner than she thought it would. When I was talking to her a couple of days ago, so.
So did they plan to stay, or?
I think most of them were planning to stay, as far as I know. I think one of them was hoping to move off, but she was the one who had lived in the foster system and whatnot too, so she had her own kind of experience about that, which was also quite interesting that they all felt so. Yeah. Either.
Wondering if I Don't Know More came up.
Did not.
It didn't.
No, a lot of the things, and I was also very surprised by this. It's a lot of the movements and stuff that we hear about, and a lot of the things that we are generally aware of did not come up at all with the youth. And it wasn't that I didn't want them to bring it up. I just didn't. They just, which was kind of interesting. Sean's.
From my experience with my own culture, and to a certain extent maybe with people from white cultures in general, there's a certain disconnect with that as well. I know that I deeply regret not having my mother's Mennonite culture and German culture passed down to me. Do you see any connection between a loss of culture within non-Aboriginal Canadians, like a relationship between that and the the loss of culture within the Aboriginal community, and if so, are there any connections between the two that might possibly exist?
Not sure I got your whole question.
I'm not sure I do.
I guess I don't know how to answer that. Is that okay? I'll think about it and get back to you. If that's okay. We can talk about it sometime this week.
Kendall, are there any live stream questions?
No, none right now.
Dad, do you have questions?
I feel like I've been a bit.
I just want to comment.
Oh,
I just think it's really neat, Kailyn, how, because I'm passionate about the environment and just honestly going to school in the last few years and how you sort of took psychology and English. I just think it's really neat how it's like, your thesis is sort of a part of you. And I know like for me it was the same thing, it was like a part of me. I just think it's really neat how you do that, because it just gives you such a different way of, just in your presentation and just like, I think that you have a lot to give, and I'm curious about like what's going to happen when you kind of go back home and like what
Me too.
what you're going to do, and like because you work at the park, and I just think like I'm just really curious to sort of like see what's gonna where this is gonna take you, and I think that it's just really, I'm so excited to be here and being shared.
thank you.
And that's a nice segue, because I was going to say that I was remiss, I think, at the beginning to not welcome. I want to welcome the alumni who have come back for our 40th anniversary celebration. It's a great way to get started into the celebrations of the 40th anniversary. So for those alumni that are here and those that will be coming and joining us as the week goes on, like a huge welcome back for all of you. And I don't want this to be precedent setting, but I did pick up a little gift for Kailyn to commemorate. Well, just because I came across it and it was so appropriate. So this is for you and for Shady. Because I really wanted to give you this book anyway. Thank you so much.
She's great at giving presents.
Oh, and Walter, like, I should have thought of something for you, but thank you.
It's a nice thought.
Yeah, so, well, I'm sure, as you all know, and as Nicole pointed out, I mean, this is a topic about which Kailyn is really passionate, interested, and so she will engage in conversation with any of you at any time.
That's true. I probably won't bring it up because I don't think I've done that much this entire semester. Other people who do know what I was talking about today.
And the thesis will be available in the library, and so if you want to follow up and read her thesis, which is excellent. So thank you all again for being here. Thanks, Kailyn, for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.